Welcome to BHC Today for Tuesday, August 2nd. The Tuesday night men's Bible study just finished going through 1st and 2nd Samuel. David, the second king of Israel, is the focus of much of these two books. David's story might be described as a rags to riches story. A poor shepherd boy, the youngest of 8 boys, becomes king, rules for 40 years during the most prosperous times of Israel. David may be most known for his encounter with Goliath. This teenager took on a giant warrior who had intimidated the entire Israelite army, and he won. But like us, he was human. David's adulterous encounter with Bathsheba would have made national headlines. When he learned she was pregnant, he made several unsuccessful attempts at covering up his deed, but ultimately he arranged for her husband Uriah to be placed in a battle position that would surely result in his death. David had multiple wives and apparently wasn't very good at raising children. One son killed another son who had raped his half-sister. 2 sons attempted at different times to replace David as king. In spite of his failures, he apparently was a good king because he did rule for 40 years and his army was fiercely loyal. One time, leading his troops against the Philistines, he remarked that a drink from the well in Bethlehem would taste really good. The only problem was that Bethlehem was under control of the Philistines. 3 men who heard his remark decided that they should go risk their lives and made their way into Bethlehem that evening. They brought back water from the well. When they gave it to David, he refused to drink it, and he poured it out as an offering to God, saying that it was too precious to drink. So like us, there is good and bad in David's life. Even so, he's described as a man after God's own heart. And how can that be? Many, perhaps most of us, could say we haven't killed, committed adultery, had multiple wives, or did as poorly as David in raising our families. John Mackenzie, a noted Catholic theologian, once described David as, quote, a bloodthirsty, oversexed bandit, end quote. So clearly David was far from perfect, but most of the time he was focused on following God. Although Israel was focused on following God's rules, David seemed to be more focused on his relationship with God. And many of the Psalms that he wrote are still very relevant today. David was a remarkable man. Walter Brueggemann, a well-known Bible scholar, wrote, and I read, "On one hand, David is much like us. There is something genuinely human about him, which means there is a shape to his life that we can count on and identify with. There is also a freedom about him that makes him interesting and not boring. But even while we're able to identify with him, there is a distance between David and us. That distance is because of his nerve and grandeur in which he can make the great gesture. There's a tough faith that permits this one to yield in simple ways that seem genuine and not contrived. There is then the ability to identify with and yet to be called out beyond ourselves, for we know that we are in the presence of greatness." End of quote. David waited for God. He had multiple opportunities to kill King Saul, but refused because Saul was God's anointed king. He accepted God's timing. He worshiped God as evidenced by the many psalms he wrote. He regularly asked God for guidance before taking action. When he didn't follow God's leading and was confronted, he didn't make excuses but admitted guilt, repented, asked for forgiveness, and accepted the consequences of his bad choices. Like David, there are times when we don't ask or listen for God's guidance and often get into trouble. And like David, we suffer the consequences of our decisions. Like David, we can worship God with praise and thanksgiving. And although David had a relationship with God, we have much more. As followers of Jesus Christ, we have the assurance that if we admit our sin, repent, and follow God's leading, we can confidently look forward to continuing our relationship with God for eternity. Have a great day.